Hello there. My name is Ian. Today we're talking about Danille Elise Christensen's Simply Necessity, because there's a question mark. Simply Necessity, Agency and Aesthetics in Southern Home Canning. I like this article because it's one of those ones that explores the traditional as is seemingly commonly understood and then checking it against the actual historical record. And in a way, one of the things that she's talking about, it's about canning, it's about preserves, and she begins in the present. And it's always good to begin in the present because she's talking basically about the reaction to early 21st century canning revivals. And more or less, she can focus it on a couple of different articles in Slate and various publications and blog posts that are bemoaning contemporary canning as some kind of elitist practice, basically as some kind of hipster practice that has been picked up as the latest food trend for whatever reason. And the main article is that the thing that is being revived is something that comes from a situation of want and deprivation and desperation, and that there is something at the very least disingenuous about this current revival. Yes, from the Slate column, in the second decade of the millennium, canning had shifted from a modest, frugal, and routine practice into one overlaid with a revivalist fervor that centered on the thriftiness, healthfulness, and environmental virtues of marmalades and dilly beans. And she says, ho, 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 ho. That just dichotomizes the past. And it changes this idea of the past, or what it's really reinforcing these notions that the past was entirely a context of want and deprivation, and that people had no choice, and fundamentally that agency wasn't part of it. Maybe this is a trend. Maybe we should point out that this is yet another food trend, if anything else, legitimate. And what is also clear is that we shouldn't paper over the idea that that canning was born in modest circumstances. But the idea that there was no agency at the time, the idea that canning couldn't have been a pleasurable activity, that it couldn't have been expressive, is depriving a population, the poor, the rural, and that generation, of agency. It's just like, oh, they're just under desperate circumstances and desperations. Canning has never been entirely out of necessity. And that's not to say that it hasn't been born from necessity, but it can't be defined entirely by necessity. She begins laying out that there's no way that she is trying to diminish the idea that want was a circumstance and has been a circumstance for many people in the United States and globally, but particularly in the United States, for a long period of time, up until perhaps most recently. And most recently, the lack of access to food is in part due to markets and in part due to things like what we might call food swamps, where food is technically available, but it isn't necessarily of hyper nutritious value. And so people are being sustained. Food is available. So starvation isn't, or that kind of deprivation isn't in place. But for certain segments of the population, their only access to food is in the sort of mass-produced, high-fat, high-sugar contexts. Nor is she dismissing the idea that this was a significant amount of labor that was required. That canning, taking, preserving enough food for basically an entire year, or certainly the entire gap between things being in season, was a significant amount of effort, and gendered effort in particular, that this was part of women's domestic economy, and that it was laborious, and that it was potentially sometimes dangerous, and it was tiring, and it might not have necessarily reaped the status that amount of labor might otherwise have accorded. So she's not suggesting that. But she is saying this: still, archival work suggests that reducing past rural domestic practice to duty or deprivation alone ignores the agency and aesthetic sophistication of people already marginalized by gender, region, race, and other contributors to socioeconomic status. Women from the coal camps of West Virginia to the wetlands of Louisiana have had much to say about need, beauty, display, and exchange as they've discussed the production of home bottled foods. And this can extend elsewhere in the United States. Her field of inquiry just happens to be the southern United States. In a very early documentary, well, not that early, from the 1970s, that was produced in part by Bill Ferris, Addie Mae Dotson and her husband Lewis. They were there in part for Lewis and his music, but they were in awe of Annie Mae and how she was Adele Mae, and how she was doing the canning at the time. And even then, in circumstances of want, and there was when one sees the film, which unfortunately is only available in archival form, so it's not available online, sees the film, it is harsh circumstances. Nevertheless, as she is canning, a couple of things starts to emerge. First, that as Danille points out later in the article, that it wouldn't be beyond reason for them to actually be freezing by this time, and she points to other people in the neighborhood and other people in her community who, rather than canning, are engaged in freezing, and they have deep freezers, and there's something enviable about that. And that maybe with a little bit more investment, perhaps they're not quite at that circumstance, but it might be something that they could invest in and preserve their food through freezing. But it would lose something in the taste of the foods that she likes. Just as importantly is the idea that she is canning not simply for herself, but particularly for the taste immediately of her husband. She's demonstrating canning peaches. I don't particularly like peaches. I don't like sweet things. I much prefer I'd be eating vegetables and so on. But she is doing it to accommodate, and she is finding it joyful. She is actually engaged in the act of canning, in part because she is demonstrating something with it. She's demonstrating domesticity. She's demonstrating her skills. There's a satisfaction that comes from doing something successfully. She's also, not simply by how she is doing, but what she is canning, she is demonstrating concern for others. And it's not simply the peaches for her husband. Later on, she points out that even though she prefers white potatoes, she always also cans some sweet potatoes. Again, because she doesn't like sweet things that much, but she'll can those in case company requires it. So it's not even for her own family, it is for the community, which undercuts that accusation that canning is born out of these dire circumstances and only in terms of like desperate need. If it were desperate need, you would imagine something a little bit more desperate. You would imagine the idea that canning is sort of a form of hoarding, that canning is basically a way of ensuring the food resources of the family. And although, yes, it is ensuring the food resources of the family, it is also aimed at sociability. It is also aimed at community. It is also aimed at going out into the broader world and being able to share one's food, to enact community through canning as well. This idea that there is craft satisfaction, that one of the things that canning does is, or one of the things that canning allows for, as it were, is a physical manifestation of labor that you can actually sort of sit back, stand back and go, look at this. And you've probably experienced something yourself if you have been engaged in any kind of craft, where whether that is a big batch of baking, or maybe you can yourself, whether that is a fabric craft project, whether that is painting, whether that is woodworking, etc. Even mowing a lawn. I mean, it is labor, but it also requires a certain amount of understanding and know-how and skill, and you can stand back and you can actually see the fruits of your labor, literally in terms of the peaches, but you can demonstrate that you have done something. And there is something very satisfying about that. And this is a point that she doesn't necessarily raise, but you want to contrast the canning with other forms of food preparation that are just that much more ephemeral. That yes, you can take satisfaction in the creation of a meal, but you don't necessarily get much of an opportunity to sort of stand back and behold the meal before it is ultimately whittled away by being eaten. You want it to be eaten, and you want it to be eaten fresh and hot and all those things. So there's only like that glimmer of appreciation. I guess now you can take a food picture and post it to Instagram, but for the most part, that kind of labor is ephemeral. In that it disappears, which is a lot of women's domestic labor, because it has to do with much more having to do with the cycles of the domestic day, which are daily, maybe weekly, and not so much yearly, apart from ephemeral events that might be scheduled cyclically, like family, high holiday suppers, for example. There isn't a huge amount of time to sort of sit in quiet contemplation with one's labor. And so these opportunities to demonstrate this kind of skill, necessary skill, but nevertheless a necessary skill that you can then sit back and behold for a little bit, is quite wonderful. She talks later on in the article about the sheer aesthetics of it, the sheer aesthetics of what makes for a good canned jar, and how you want the liquid to be clear, you want the beans or whatever to be aligned in some kind of, if not necessarily geometric, that might not be the word, at least some kind of pattern. You want the jars to be filled basically to the same levels, to maximize. If you have something like a strawberry, you want the geometry of the strawberry to be beheld, to be part of the aesthetics of the event. Then not simply on the level of the jar or on the level of the batch, because you want consistency from jar to jar, but also on the level of the display, where you have these racks. Roverty Wills told Catherine Martin in 1979 that she sorted the jars by general categories, by specific contents, and then by color, so that all peaches took their place within the fruit section, with white peaches to the left of the golden ones, each of them hot-packed by nested halves, in order to assure a full, tight arrangement within each jar. Jams and jellies shifted gradually across the shelves, from the deep reds of raspberry preserves to the purples of grape jelly and the dense darkness of blackberry jam. Among the vegetables, Wills enhanced the intensity of the beets by waiting to trim the tops completely until after the roots had been boiled, and she added texture and rhythm to her shells with the vertical lines of corn canned whole on the cob. Preferring to hull beans whose pods were defaced before adding them to the prettier cut ones, her jars displayed a Morse code of dots and dashes. That's just poetry. And there's poetry not simply in Christensen's description of it, But fundamentally, there's poetry in the glass. There's no real requirement. There's probably a concession to organization as a value and as a tool of efficiency. But clearly there is also aesthetics involved. There is a balance, there is a pride that is being enacted through that. So here we have domestic labor, most of which disappears over time. Think of other forms of women's domestic labor. There's the laying of the table and the dismantling of the table. There is the doing of the dishes. There's the cooking of the food. There is the doing of laundry. There's so many really fascinating documentaries about clotheslines and the laying of laundry on a line, and then the folding of laundry and putting things into cupboards as some kind of display. You know it's going to be dismantled. They know that the food is going to be eaten. Adele May talks at one point about how if she does all this canning and 2 days later she wants a pea or a bean, she is going to open up a jar. She's not doing it with the sake that they are never going to be opened. Expressly the opposite. But until they are opened, they are these objects of women's labor that can be celebrated. More than that, they're not always single items. One of the things that, again, these Slate columnists who are decrying hipsters were talking about is how, these are all super fancy, contemporary, hipster quinces and exotic fruits and so on. That is just not what the Southern canners, or not what American canners, or basically not what the poor would do. And clearly that actually isn't the case either, in that if you look at canning, I mean, perhaps on the level of sheer volume, maybe, that there were, more cans of unified whole crops, like these are just going to be beans, were done than specialties. But specialties were rife. And she points out to one cookbook where it's like an 85-page cookbook, and only 10 about canning, a guide to canning, and only 10 pages are about how to can specific single items, how to do grapes, how to do green beans, how to do carrots, and so on. And then the rest were recipes for much more complex confections, more complicated jams, and then some very ornate things with things stuffed inside other things, and various forms of pickles, and that sort of strange pickled mango recipe that she points out. It's not even a mango; it's a melon that's stuffed with like sauerkraut. It's like, what's going on there? I'm intrigued. So immediately, no, people were experimenting with different forms of recipes back then. So we have them as items of labor. We have them as, they might have been born under specific consequences. And it's clear that over time, there are elements of canning that do get dropped in favor of modern technologies. It's like, this way is simpler. Not single-handedly. Convenience and the economics and the expediency are not always going to be the selling point for adapting a new technology and throwing away an old one, or evolving away from an old one. Even when that is available, people make choices. Okay, I am going to be freezing these things, but these things that matter to me, I'm going to continue canning, despite the fact that I could be doing it more efficiently, potentially even more economically, if I continue to do it this way. So there is still choice. There is still agency. There is still deliberateness that is done. And it's done because there is a desire to keep. Sorry, it's not a desire to maintain tradition. I always think that is too glib an idea that people are constantly sort of not changing because they want to keep things traditional. They want to keep things that way because they like doing it that way, which seems like an obvious point, but it is precisely the point that Danille is trying to make, that they are doing it because they want to do it this way, because they find pleasure doing it this way. They find pleasure in the food, so that they think it better or cleaner or whatever their appropriate group of adjectives that have positive connotations that might have a parallel set in contemporary urban canners who have their own vocabulary of what constitutes good or better food. So they might be thinking about natural and cleaner, and the traditional group might be thinking, crisp and crunch, but they're both basically emphasizing their shared aesthetic about what constitutes good food, and they choose to do it. So on one hand, there's the idea that sometimes they don't have a choice of doing it or not, but even within those circumstances, they can find joy, artistry, self-expression, pride, accomplishment, commensality, the role of the gift from Marcel Mauss situation, the idea of participation in an economy that is based on exchange. So many canners that I know, well, for one thing, I don't live in an agrarian society, so they're not canning their own things necessarily, although they might have gone to like a U-pick or something and collected a whole bunch, and then they will share crops. It's like, oh, I've got a whole bunch of blueberries I can't possibly can, but I'm really interested in this, and they might switch. Or conversely, they will use these as exchange, and other people who are canning other things will come back. Now, this is in a thick middle class milieu, like most of the people in my peer group, and so they are already doing it not out of necessity, but out of as a hobby, as a way of display. And that's the point that she ends on. She begins in the present day, and she goes back to the past to demonstrate that agency and choice and pride and things beyond mere deprivation were occasions for canning, even back then. And the persistence of canning and its retention long after it isn't a necessary thing. So she's dispelling that idea of necessary. And then she brings it back to the present day and says, well, maybe there is something beyond the fact that it is hip or fun that this contemporary generation is doing, that they have rediscovered or they have reclaimed, depending on how they consider this as part or not of their heritage. But they are engaged in canning, and doing so not simply as some kind of hipster doofus exercise, but as a way of participating in friendship circles, in communities where exchange and gifts and communitas and the non-hierarchical aspect, like a blogosphere, like most fan communities, like most friendship communities, and even and communities that don't necessarily exist in real space, but only exist in online communities, that nevertheless they can participate in this. And so they are getting something more than simple fun out of this, in a way that the almost romantic in its narrative of hardship rural past was getting something more than getting base requirements on a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, getting those fulfilled. There was joy to be had here, and there is the real work of community building that is happening in the contemporary canning sphere. So what a delightful article. Don't you just want to go open a can of something? Pop as the mason lid loosens. Oh, so very well and good. And then you have the jars. and then you can make cocktails. And then you can really be a hipster doofus. But that's okay. My son drinks his water from mason jars. I don't know why. I don't know how that started, but he does. So I got a cabinet full of them. Hipster, thy name is vanity. Thy name is thou self. Hold a mirror up. I'm going to stop talking now. So, my name is Ian. Today we've been talking about Danille Elise Christensen's Simply Necessity, Agency and Aesthetics in Southern Home Canning. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, eat well, and I will see you soon.